Chains clattered in the cold December air as the overseer's body swayed from the rafters. Blood still stained the wooden floor of the plantation barn, where the Christmas feast had moments earlier echoed with drunken laughter. The master's house was burning in the distance, its flames tearing open the night sky. And at the heart of this chaos stood one man, once bound, once beaten, once silenced. A slave whose revenge on Christmas night, 1832, would shake the entire plantation forever. The story begins not with fire, not with blood, but with silence. A silence that wrapped itself around the Louisiana plantation like a suffocating fog. The year was 1832, and in the heart of sugarcane country, men and women worked from dawn to nightfall, their backs bent under the unforgiving sun, their wrists rubbed raw by the iron of chains. Among them was Samuel, a man known not for his strength, though he had plenty, but for his quiet watchfulness. Samuel had been born into bondage 28 years earlier. His earliest memories were not of a mother's lullaby or the laughter of childhood, but of the whip cracking through the air, followed by a scream that would echo through his bones for years to come. His mother, Sarah, had tried to shield him, but she was sold when Samuel was only 7. He never saw her again. From that day forward, he carried her absence like a wound that never closed. The plantation belonged to Master Henry Caldwell, a man who inherited both land and cruelty from his father. Caldwell's fields stretched for miles, filled with sugarcane that cut like knives and swallowed men whole in their labor. Every stalk that rose toward the Louisiana sky was watered with sweat and blood. But the true terror of the plantation was not the master. It was the overseer, Elias Granger. Granger was tall, broad-shouldered, and ruthless. His voice was gravel, his eyes like cold steel, and his whip never left his hand. He relished cruelty the way others relished wine. A misswing of the hoe, a stumble under a heavy load, or even a glance held too long could summon punishment. For Samuel, Granger's presence was a constant shadow, a reminder that suffering was not accidental here. It was deliberate, calculated, and unrelenting. Samuel's chains were not always iron. They were woven into the rhythms of life itself. He awoke before sunrise to the sound of the overseer's horn, his body aching from the day before. He marched to the fields alongside dozens of others, their bare feet sinking into damp soil. Cane knives glistened in the morning light, and with each swing, the stalks fell, their sweetness meant only for the master's profit. By sundown, his hands would blister, and by nightfall, he would collapse on the wooden floor of a cabin so cramped that the air itself felt like another chain. Yet even within that suffering, Samuel's mind was not still. He carried memories and whispers of freedom. Other slaves spoke of uprisings in distant states, of men and women who dared to resist. In the dark of night, hushed voices told stories of poisoned masters, burned houses, and daring escapes through the swamps. Samuel listened, and though he said little, the words rooted themselves deep within him. They did not blossom yet, but they waited, like sparks buried under ash. The plantation had its moments of cruel irony, times when suffering was dressed as celebration. None was more bitter than Christmas. For the Caldwell family, Christmas was a season of excess, grand feasts, barrels of rum, music echoing from the big house. For the enslaved, it was often a week of forced cheer, sometimes small allowances of food or cloth, but always under the gaze of overseers who never let them forget their place. Samuel despised Christmas not because of what he lacked, but because it flaunted what was denied him. He would watch the master's children open gifts by the fire, while his own memories of family had been stolen by the auction block. Still, Samuel endured. His endurance was his weapon, though he did not yet know it. He worked silently, observing, memorizing every routine of the overseer, every weakness in the system that bound him. He learned when Granger drank most heavily, when the guards around the storage barns grew lax, and how the master's house glowed brightest during the feast, its laughter drowning out other sounds. Samuel's silence was not surrender, it was study. Among the other slaves, Samuel was neither the loudest nor the most outspoken, but he was trusted. His eyes, dark and steady, carried a calmness that drew others to confide in him. One of them was Ruth, a woman only a few years younger than Samuel. She had been beaten nearly to death after refusing the overseer's advances, and Samuel had tended her wounds in the shadows of the cabins. From that moment, a bond formed between them, not quite love, for love was dangerous under chains, but something deeper: solidarity, a shared determination that one day things could not remain as they were. Every scar Samuel carried told a story. The welt across his back from the time he collapsed in the fields from exhaustion. The twisted knuckle from when he tried to shield a boy from the overseer's whip. The jagged line across his forearm from a cane knife that slipped in his hand. These scars were not marks of weakness, they were reminders that he had survived. And in surviving, he had grown patient. The plantation nights were long. Crickets sang in the grass, owls called from the trees, and the air was thick with the smell of cane, sweat, and wood smoke. In those nights, Samuel often lay awake staring at the ceiling of the cabin. He would listen to the labored breathing of the others, the restless turning of men and women whose dreams were chained as tightly as their bodies. And he would think, not of escape alone, but of justice. Not of fleeing silently into the swamp, but of striking a blow that would make the master and overseer remember the name Samuel long after the chains had fallen. But dreams of rebellion were dangerous things. They had to be hidden, spoken only in coded hymns and whispered prayers. Samuel knew well the price of discovery. Just 2 years earlier, another slave named Daniel had been hanged for plotting an escape. His body was left swinging in the yard for 3 days as a warning. The image of Daniel's lifeless form haunted Samuel, but it did not deter him. If anything, it hardened him. By the autumn of 1832, Samuel's endurance had begun to transform into something else. The whispers of resistance grew louder, the weight of grief heavier, and the cruelty of the overseer sharper. Each lash, each insult, each stolen moment of dignity pressed Samuel closer to a breaking point. He did not yet know what form it would take: poison, fire, blade, or rope, but deep inside, a storm was gathering. And as Christmas approached, with its feasts and drunken laughter, Samuel began to notice opportunities. The overseer would drink more heavily. The master's attention would be fixed on celebration. The guards would loosen, lulled by the illusion of holiday peace. Samuel did not yet act. But he watched. He waited. And within him, the quiet man with the steady eyes began to shape a plan. What he would do next would not just be an act of survival. It would be an act of vengeance, born of years of silence, scars, and stolen family. And on Christmas night, 1832, that vengeance would erupt in a way no one on the Caldwell plantation could ever forget. Cruelty on the Caldwell plantation was not random, it was ritual. Overseer Elias Granger made certain of that. For him, discipline was not merely a duty but a performance, a spectacle meant to terrify. He believed fear was stronger than food, stronger than rest, stronger even than the whip itself. And Samuel had lived under this reign of terror long enough to understand just how calculated it was. Granger's punishments came swift and brutal. A child who dropped a basket of cane would feel the bite of his whip. A woman who paused to wipe sweat from her brow would be shoved into the dirt. And for men like Samuel, who worked harder than most, the overseer saved his cruelties for moments when they stung deepest. He did not simply want obedience, he wanted submission. One December morning, just weeks before Christmas, Samuel watched as Granger dragged a boy named Isaac into the center of the field. Isaac was only 12, small and wiry, but his knife had slipped, cutting through a stalk unevenly. That was enough. Granger forced Isaac to his knees, binding his wrists in chains while the other slaves were ordered to watch. Samuel's jaw tightened as the whip cracked again and again across the boy's back. Isaac's cry split the air like a hymn of pain, and the overseer's smirk widened with each strike. When it was over, Isaac lay unconscious in the mud. Granger spat on him before walking away. It was in moments like this that Samuel's silence became unbearable. He wanted to leap forward, to seize the whip from Granger's hand, to turn the cruelty back on the man who delivered it. But Samuel knew better. Recklessness would only bring death, and not just for himself. Everyone would suffer. So he clenched his fists, swallowed his rage, and burned the memory deep into his heart. The master, Henry Caldwell, was no better. He left the daily cruelties to Granger, but his absence of mercy was just as damning. Caldwell valued slaves only as tools, measured not in flesh and spirit, but in pounds of sugar and barrels of molasses. On nights when he drank too deeply, he would brag about the wealth he had accumulated, boasting that his plantation was a kingdom built on obedience. Yet Samuel knew the truth. It was a kingdom built on chains. The cabins where the slaves slept were little more than wooden cages. Drafts slipped through cracks in the walls, and the smell of damp earth clung to the air. Children cried through the night from hunger, and the elderly coughed themselves to sleep. Food was meager: cornmeal, salt pork when luck allowed, and whatever scraps could be stolen from the fields. At times, Samuel would slip a portion of his meal to Ruth, who still bore the physical scars of Granger's assault. She tried to refuse, but Samuel insisted. "Strength," he whispered, "you'll need it." As Christmas drew closer, cruelty deepened. Granger seemed to take pleasure in ramping up punishments, as though to remind the enslaved that joy was forbidden. The season that promised feasts and gifts for the Caldwell family brought only hunger and fear for the cabins. The overseer's voice barked louder, his whip cracked sharper, and the days bled into nights of restless bitterness. One evening, Samuel and Ruth sat by the faint glow of the fire inside the cabin. Around them, the others slept fitfully. Ruth's voice trembled as she spoke. "Do you ever think that God sees?" she asked. Samuel looked at her, his face lit only by the flickering flames. "He sees," he said softly. "But he waits." Ruth frowned. "Waits for what?" Samuel's eyes darkened. "For us to act." Those words lingered in the air like smoke. Ruth said nothing more, but Samuel could see the fear in her eyes. She knew what he meant. She knew what was building inside him. And though she feared for him, a part of her longed for it too. The breaking point came one night when Granger stormed into the cabins unannounced. He claimed he had lost a bottle of rum and accused the slaves of stealing it. Without evidence, he began dragging men outside one by one, lashing them until their backs bled. When he reached Samuel, he paused. Granger had always despised Samuel's silence, mistaking it for defiance. He pressed the whip's handle against Samuel's chin, tilting his face upward. "You think you're better than the rest of them?" Granger sneered. "You think those quiet eyes hide something? I'll break you yet." He shoved Samuel to the floor, delivering a lash across his back before storming out into the night. Samuel lay on the ground, his body trembling not from pain, but from fury. The sting of the whip was nothing compared to the humiliation of being struck before his people, of being marked once again like cattle. He stared at the dirt floor until his vision blurred, and in that moment, something inside him hardened into stone. From then on, every sound of the whip, every cry of a child, every insult from the overseer was fuel. Samuel no longer thought only of survival. He thought of fire. He thought of rope. He thought of the overseer's blood staining the earth the way his people's blood had stained it for generations. Christmas Eve arrived, and with it, the master's annual feast. The big house gleamed with candlelight. Carriages rolled up the drive, bringing neighbors and friends in their finest clothes. Music drifted through the night air, laughter spilling into the darkness. From the cabins, Samuel could see the glow of it all, a cruel reminder of the worlds divided by chains. The slaves were given scraps of extra food that night, but it was nothing more than a mockery. Samuel tasted bitterness with every bite. The overseer, drunk on rum, patrolled the grounds more sloppily than usual. His steps wavered, his voice slurred, and the whip in his hand dragged lazily across the dirt. Samuel watched him from the shadows, his eyes sharp, his mind clear. Every mistake Granger made that night, every careless move, etched itself into Samuel's plan. The stage was being set. Christmas was not just a feast for the master, it would be a reckoning. Samuel's fury had ripened into resolve, and his patience had become a blade sharper than any cane knife. The chains that bound him would soon become the very tools of his revenge. And on that night, when the master and his guests raised their glasses in drunken celebration, Samuel whispered to himself the words that had carried him through every lash, every scar, every stolen moment of dignity. He waits for us to act. What Samuel did next would turn Christmas night 1832 into a night of fire, blood, and unforgettable vengeance. The night of December 25, 1832, began like any other Christmas on the Caldwell plantation, at least on the surface. The master's house roared with laughter, its windows glowing with warmth while music spilled into the cold air. Servants hurried in and out with trays of roasted meats, pies, and bottles of wine. Children squealed as they unwrapped gifts by the fire. The Caldwell family lived as though the world itself bent to their comfort. But outside, in the cabins, a different world breathed. The air was thick with tension, though none dared speak of it. The slaves were given scraps of ham and cornbread, a gift meant to mimic generosity. But Samuel did not eat. He sat silently in the corner, staring at the small flame of the cabin lamp as though it were a vision. His mind was no longer among the weary and hungry. It was already in motion, already walking the steps of what was to come. Ruth noticed his stillness. "Samuel," she whispered, her voice trembling, "don't do what I think you're planning." He looked at her, his gaze steady but heavy with unspoken truth. "We've bled long enough," he said softly. "If not now, then never." Her eyes filled with fear. "They'll kill you." Samuel's lips curved into something that was not quite a smile. "They've been killing me my whole life. Tonight, I choose how it ends." Those words silenced her. She lowered her head, tears glistening in the firelight. Deep inside, she knew there was no stopping him. The overseer Elias Granger was drunk that night. Drunker than Samuel had ever seen him. He staggered through the yard, barking slurred orders at shadows that weren't there. The whip dragged limply behind him, its crack replaced by the sound of leather scraping over dirt. A bottle of rum swung from his hand, spilling drops that glistened under the moonlight. Samuel followed at a distance, moving like a shadow himself. Every sound of laughter from the big house covered his steps. Every burst of music drowned the quiet rasp of his breath. He watched as Granger stumbled toward the barn, muttering curses under his breath. Samuel's hand tightened around the length of chain he had smuggled from the tool shed days earlier. It was heavy, cold, and alive with possibility. When Granger entered the barn, Samuel knew the moment had come. He slipped inside silently, the smell of hay and manure thick in the air. The overseer fumbled with a lantern, nearly dropping it as he set it on a beam. He cursed loudly, then raised the bottle to his lips. That was when he heard it, the soft clatter of chain on wood. He turned, eyes narrowing. "Who's there?" His voice was sharp, but it wavered. From the shadows, Samuel stepped forward. His silhouette was tall, his eyes unflinching. For a moment, Granger blinked in disbelief. A slave standing before him unbound, unafraid. That was a sight he had never prepared for. "You," Granger spat, stumbling forward. "You think you can sneak up on me?" "I'll—" The words never finished. Samuel swung the chain with a force that cracked through the barn like thunder. The iron struck Granger's jaw, sending the bottle shattering to the ground. The overseer roared, reaching for his whip, but Samuel was faster. He lunged, wrapping the chain around Granger's throat, pulling tight with a strength born of decades of suffering. Granger clawed at the iron, his face turning red, then purple. His boots kicked against the wooden floor, knocking over tools and scattering hay. Samuel's arms trembled with the effort, but his grip never faltered. He could hear the overseer's rasping breath, the desperate gurgle of a man unprepared for his own mortality. "You took everything," Samuel hissed, his voice low and steady. "Now I take you." With a final heave, Samuel dragged Granger toward the rafters where ropes for the horses hung. In one swift motion, he looped the chain over the beam, tightening it until the overseer's body lifted from the floor. Granger's boots thrashed in the air, his eyes bulging with terror, until finally, silence. The body swayed slowly, the chain creaking against the beam. For the first time in his life, Samuel stood taller than the overseer. He looked into the lifeless face and felt not joy, not triumph, but release. Years of humiliation, of scars and broken bones, now had a counterweight. Samuel had struck back. But Samuel knew it was not over. Killing Granger was only the beginning. The true blow would be against the master himself. He left the barn quietly, his hands trembling, the overseer's corpse swaying in the shadows behind him. From the yard, Samuel could hear the feast in full swing. Laughter and song carried through the air, along with the smell of roasted goose and wine. The big house glowed brighter than ever, candles lining every window. Samuel moved toward it with measured steps, the weight of his decision pressing heavy but steady on his chest. Inside, the Caldwells and their guests were lost in celebration. Musicians played fiddles and flutes, children danced, and the master raised his glass for a toast. "To another year of prosperity," he declared, his words dripping with arrogance. "May this land, this house, and all within it continue to grow." The guests cheered, clinking glasses. Not one of them knew that outside, a man they called Slave was walking closer, his hands still warm from the overseer's death. Not one of them knew that the night would end not in prosperity, but in fire and blood. Samuel paused at the edge of the porch, his eyes fixed on the glow of the feast. He could feel the heat of anger in his veins, the pulse of his mother's memory, the weight of Isaac's cries, the sting of the whip on his back. Everything that had ever been stolen from him lived in this moment. He whispered again the words he had spoken to Ruth. "If not now, then never." With that, Samuel stepped into the light. The turning point had come. The overseer lay slaughtered in the barn, chains around his throat. And the master's house, filled with laughter, wine, and arrogance, was about to face the storm Samuel had carried in silence for 28 years. What happened next would turn Christmas night into a blaze of vengeance the plantation would never forget. The Caldwell mansion glittered with light, every candle blazing, every glass brimming with wine. Music filled the great hall, fiddles screeching, flutes piping, boots pounding against polished floors in drunken rhythm. It was Christmas night, and the master's world was drenched in comfort, oblivious to the storm brewing outside. Samuel approached slowly, the night air cold against his skin, though he did not feel it. His body was burning with purpose, his heart hammering not with fear, but with finality. The chain that had strangled the overseer was still slick with sweat and blood. He gripped it like a weapon forged for this very night. He climbed the steps of the porch, each creak of wood drowned beneath the laughter and clinking of glasses. Through the windows, he could see Master Caldwell at the head of the table, his flushed face glowing in the candlelight, a roasted goose before him, wine dripping from his lips. The mistress leaned close, whispering to her guests, their jeweled necklaces catching the light. The children tore through ribbons and paper, shrieking with joy. It was a picture of abundance, of gluttony, and every second of it stood on Samuel's back, on Ruth's scars, on Isaac's blood. Samuel pressed his palm against the door. His breath was steady. His eyes were clear. he whispered once more. "If not now, then never." And then he pushed. The door swung open with a groan that silenced the room. Music screeched to a halt, laughter died mid-breath, and every head turned. There stood Samuel, his dark figure framed by the night, chains hanging from his hand like the shadow of judgment itself. For a moment, the guests blinked in disbelief. To them, he was nothing more than a slave, a shadow meant to serve and bow, not to interrupt. But Samuel did not bow. He stepped into the hall, his boots striking the floor with the weight of thunder. "Samuel?" Master Caldwell barked, rising from his chair. His voice was sharp, but beneath it trembled something he had never felt toward his slave: fear. "What do you think you're doing, boy?" Samuel said nothing. Instead, he raised the chain, its iron links clattering against the wooden floor like the echo of every lash he had ever received. Gasps rippled through the room. The mistress clutched her pearls, the children whimpered, the guests froze. Caldwell's face twisted in rage. "Put that down before I—" But Samuel cut him off, not with words, but with fire. He flung the lantern he had carried in from the barn, its oil splattering across the curtains. In an instant, flames leapt upward, devouring fabric, crawling along the walls. Screams erupted as the fire roared, filling the hall with the stench of smoke and burning wood. Panic seized the room. Guests scrambled to their feet, overturning chairs, spilling wine and food across the table. The children wailed, clutching at their mother's skirts. The mistress shrieked, her voice piercing above the chaos. But Samuel stood firm, the firelight casting his shadow across the walls like a specter of vengeance. Caldwell lunged forward, seizing a carving knife from the table. "You'll pay for this, slave," he roared. He charged, his face contorted with fury. Samuel met him head-on. The chain swung with brutal force, striking Caldwell across the chest and sending him sprawling backward into the table. Plates shattered, wine spilled like blood, and the master gasped for breath, clutching at his ribs. The guests scattered, some rushing for the doors, others frozen in shock. The fire climbed higher, devouring the garlands, the paintings, the very structure of the mansion. Smoke thickened, curling into the lungs of all who remained. Caldwell staggered to his feet, his knife still clenched, his pride refusing to surrender. "You think you can kill me?" He spat, his voice hoarse from smoke. "I own you. I own everything you are." Samuel's eyes blazed, his voice deep and steady. "Not tonight." With a roar, the master lunged again. Samuel sidestepped, wrapping the chain around Caldwell's arm, twisting it until the knife clattered to the floor. With one brutal heave, he pulled the master forward, then struck. The chain slammed into Caldwell's throat, driving him to his knees. The once mighty master choked, gasped, clawed at the iron links, his face red with terror. The mistress screamed, rushing forward, but Samuel turned on her, his gaze so fierce she froze in place. He did not strike her, not yet. Instead, he shoved Caldwell backward into the roaring flames. The master's body crashed against the burning curtains, his screams swallowed by fire. The great Henry Caldwell, who had boasted of prosperity and dominion, was reduced to ash before the eyes of his guests. Chaos reigned. Some fled into the night, coughing and choking. Others fell to the smoke and fire. The children were dragged from the hall by terrified relatives. The mistress clawed at her husband's burning form, her shrieks echoing through the inferno. And Samuel stood tall amidst the storm, the chain in his hand, the fire reflected in his eyes. For the first time in his life, he was not bound. He was the one who decided. He was the one who delivered judgment. Outside, the slaves had gathered, drawn by the commotion. They watched as flames consumed the mansion, their faces lit by the fire that had been denied to them for so long. Some gasped, some prayed, some wept, but many stood in silence, their eyes wide with something they had not felt in years: hope. Ruth pushed through the crowd, her hands trembling as she reached Samuel. "What have you done?" she whispered, though her voice shook with awe as much as fear. Samuel looked at her, his chest rising and falling, his body smeared with soot and sweat. "What had to be done?" he said simply. Behind them, the mansion groaned as beams collapsed, sparks showering the sky. The overseer hung lifeless in the barn, the master burned in the fire, and the chains that had bound Samuel now swung freely from his hand. But vengeance comes at a price, and Samuel knew it. Even as the fire raged, he could hear distant shouts, neighbors, alerted by the glow in the sky, rushing to see what had happened. Dogs barked in the distance, the sound of hooves thundered closer. The night was not yet finished. Samuel turned to the others, his voice steady but urgent. "The time is now. Run. Into the swamps, into the night. Don't wait." Some hesitated, fear anchoring them. Others nodded, their eyes wide with determination. Ruth clutched Samuel's arm. "Come with us," she begged. But Samuel's gaze shifted back to the flames. He shook his head slowly. "I'm not leaving. Not yet." The slaves scattered into the night, slipping into the cover of the cane fields and the swamps beyond. Ruth lingered, tears spilling down her face. "They'll kill you," she whispered. Samuel touched her cheek gently, his hand rough but tender. "Then let them try." With that, he turned back toward the blaze, his figure framed by fire, chains clattering softly in his hand. The climax of Samuel's vengeance had arrived. The overseer slaughtered, the master burned, the plantation thrown into chaos. Christmas night, 1832, had become a night of reckoning. But what happened next, whether Samuel would escape, be captured, or become a legend, remained written only in the smoke rising into the winter sky. The Caldwell plantation would never be the same again. By dawn, its great house lay in ruins, nothing but charred beams and smoldering ash rising into the pale December sky. The air smelled of smoke and death, mingled with the sweetness of roasted cane caught in the blaze. What had been the symbol of Henry Caldwell's wealth and pride was now reduced to rubble. The land that once echoed with laughter and music carried only silence and the memory of vengeance. Word spread quickly. By sunrise, neighbors arrived on horseback, rifles slung over their shoulders, their eyes wide with shock. They found the overseer hanging lifeless in the barn, chains biting into his neck, his face purple with death. They found the master's body burned beyond recognition in the ruins of his own home. And they found chaos, guests who had fled into the night coughing and screaming, children shaken into silence, the mistress half mad with grief, clawing at the ashes with blackened hands. But they did not find Samuel. Some swore they had seen him disappear into the flames, standing tall as the roof collapsed, consumed by the fire he had unleashed. Others whispered that he had fled into the swamps with the others, vanishing into the labyrinth of cypress and shadow, never to be caught. A few even claimed they saw him walking calmly down the dirt road as dawn broke, chains clattering softly at his side, his head high as though no man could touch him. The truth was lost in smoke and rumor. What mattered was the legacy. For years afterward, the story of Christmas night 1832 was spoken in hushed tones across Louisiana. Among the masters, it was told as a warning, a tale of horror, of what happened when slaves forgot their place. They pointed to the ruins of Caldwell's estate as proof that mercy could never be afforded, that chains must be tightened, that rebellion must be crushed before it had the chance to breathe. But among the enslaved, the story was told differently. Around fires in the cabins, in whispered prayers in the fields, in songs sung softly under the cover of night, Samuel became more than a man. He became a symbol. They told of the slave who had risen against his overseer, who had slaughtered the man who carried the whip. They told of the Christmas feast that turned to fire, of the master's screams swallowed by the very house he built on suffering. They told of chains breaking, of vengeance delivered, of hope burning brighter than fear. For every child born into bondage, Samuel's name was a reminder that even in chains, a man could choose defiance. The authorities searched for weeks. Dogs were sent into the swamps, patrols combed the cane fields, and rewards were posted for information. But Samuel was never found. Perhaps he lay buried beneath the ashes of the great house. Perhaps he drowned in the swamps. Or perhaps he escaped north, vanishing into freedom under the cover of night. No one knew, and that uncertainty gave the story power. For Ruth, the memory was sharper, more painful. She had seen him that night, seen the fire in his eyes, heard the final words he whispered to her. She carried those words like scripture, then let them try. Ruth never spoke of Samuel openly again, for fear of punishment, but in the secret places of her heart, she repeated his words until her last breath. The Caldwell plantation, rebuilt years later under new ownership, never thrived as it once had. The soil seemed cursed, the cane withered, the profits dwindled. Workers whispered that the land itself remembered Samuel's vengeance, that the cries of the overseer still echoed in the barn, that the master's scream still rose from the ashes on cold Christmas nights. And so Samuel became both ghost and legend. To the masters, he was a nightmare. To the slaves, he was a hero. His story traveled farther than the fields he once cut, into the swamps, into the neighboring plantations, into the very bones of those still shackled by chains. Years passed. The world began to change, slowly, unevenly, but Samuel's story remained. Children grew up hearing it whispered at night, their eyes wide with wonder. Men carried it in their hearts as they bent beneath the cane. Women clung to it as proof that even the most broken could rise again. Samuel had become more than a man. He was a reminder that fear was not the only inheritance of slavery, resistance lived too. And though his body was never found, his vengeance lived on. The story of Christmas night, 1832 ends in fire, in chains, in the silence of ash. But its reflection does not fade. It lingers in the air like smoke. It echoes in every lash of the whip, in every prayer whispered by those in bondage. It asks a haunting question. What happens when the oppressed can no longer bear the weight of silence? Samuel answered that question with chains, with blood, with fire. He showed that even the most forgotten man, even the most beaten, even the most silenced, can rise on a single night and shatter the order of the world around him. He showed that vengeance could live in the heart of a slave, burning as fiercely as any master's fire. And though his fate remains a mystery, his story endures, passed from mouth to mouth, from cabin to cabin, from generation to generation. On Christmas night, 1832, a slave named Samuel broke his chains. He slaughtered his overseer. He burned his master. He turned a feast into a funeral. And he left behind a story that still burns, like embers refusing to die. So when you hear the wind howl through the cane fields on a cold December night, when you smell smoke in the air, though no fire burns, remember this. Samuel's revenge was not just for himself. It was for every man and woman who bore the chains, for every child torn from their mother, for every lash of the overseer's whip. And though the masters tried to bury him in silence, Samuel's story rose higher than the flames that consumed the Caldwell house. He became eternal. Chains can bind the body, but they cannot forever silence the will. On that Christmas night in 1832, one man proved it. And the world, masters and slaves alike, never forgot.